G'day everyone. At this point, we know that administrative law focuses on the decisions made by the executive arm of government, which means, in essence, the ministers and the public servants. We know that administrative law establishes rules which they have to follow, and that administrative law provides ways in which individuals can hold those public servants to account, and often have decisions overturned if they're not made properly. It's time now for us to look a little more deeply at the concept of administrative decision making. Who are these people making administrative decisions? How are they organised? How do they get the power to make decisions? These are important fundamental concepts that you need to understand from the start, or else the detail of administrative law is going to make no sense to you whatsoever. Now, the idea of a public service grew over a very long period of time, and I'm not going to trace that history because, frankly, a video on the history of the public service would put us all to sleep, including me. But it's pretty easy to understand that historically, even if a single person got hold of all the power in a society or a tribe or a clan, they were not going to be able to use all that power personally. Even the greatest ancient king was not able personally to collect all the taxes, fight all the wars, build all the roads, trade all the gold, dispense all the justice. Instead, they had to delegate this power. Really, what they're saying is that they had to have staff. So back in the day, the king had the members of their court, and then they had nobles to go out and each run a smaller part of the country. So the king was the boss of the dukes, and the dukes were the bosses of the earls, and the earls were the bosses of the barons, and the barons were the bosses of the knights, and so on, down the line to the poor peasants standing knee-deep in the mud, trying to plough a field and actually grow some food. So the king held the power, and the king gave out bits of power to different people in order for them to do stuff. Eventually, government in England transitioned to democracy, as we have here in Australia. One of the downsides of an elected parliamentary democracy is that there is a regular turnover of staff. Prime ministers come and go, ministers come and go even more often, and there are elections every 3 or 4 years where you can have an entire government thrown out on the spot. Kings and queens, on the other hand, tend to remain on the throne for a much longer time. Imagine if every time there was a new government or a new minister or a new election, they had to organise the entire government from the ground up. For instance, imagine if every time there was a new election, all the teachers in all the schools got the sack, and then when there was a new government and a new education minister, that minister began recruiting teachers again. It would be chaos. The solution that we've evolved in England and in Australia is to have what is called a permanent public service. The idea is that the basic infrastructure, the people, the organisation, the buildings, the equipment, they're all permanent. And those people, the public servants, are required to serve whatever government may be in place at any time. The public servants are expected to do this impartially. So they have to give the same level of service regardless of whether they agree with the policies of the government or not. This means that every incoming government has, waiting for it, staff and infrastructure to let the government hit the ground running. Naturally, governments reorganise and restructure things from time to time, but they're not starting from scratch. It is inevitable that these public servants make decisions and that those decisions affect people's lives. There's literally millions of these decisions. A public servant decides whether to audit your tax return, or whether someone gets a visa to enter Australia, or whether a person gets a driver's licence, or whether a student gets an allowance, or whether an area of land can be redeveloped. You get the picture? 1 million decisions a day. Some massive, some almost trivial. But all of them affect people, and all of them, at some level, require the public servant to exercise power. The public servant who, for instance, decides if you can get issued a passport has a power that you don't have. They can issue a passport and you can't. But they don't have that power because they're somehow special. We don't live in a society where people have different rights and powers depending on who they are. Instead, public servants exercise public power. They can make decisions because the Parliament, which represents all of us, has decided to grant that power to the person occupying a particular position. In turn, this means that the public servant is responsible to the more senior public servants for the way they use their powers. And those more senior public servants are responsible to the minister, and the minister is responsible to the Prime Minister and to the Parliament through the processes of responsible government. Those are the processes that we discussed in the third video. That's the theory anyway. Let's look at an example. As we know, every 3 years there's a Commonwealth election. Those elections are run by the Australian Electoral Commission. This is a government agency full of public servants. When it's election time, each House of Representatives electorate is officially known as a division, and each division has a divisional returning officer whose job basically is to run the election in that division. This is an important job, a lot of responsibility. This job is established in Section 32 of the Commonwealth Electoral Act 1918, which says there shall be a divisional returning officer for each division who shall be charged with the duty of giving effect to this act within or for the division. See how it works? The Constitution requires elections, but in order to have elections, we need people to actually do the stuff that makes an election work. That's an executive function. So the Parliament makes an electoral act and says, right, we're going to create these positions and give them authority, and then they can run off and hold the elections. If the Parliament grants people power, then it makes sense that the Parliament can also limit that power. So the Parliament can say, we are going to create a new public service position, we're going to attach some powers to that position, but then we're going to limit those powers and set some rules about how they are used. Those rules are set in two ways. First, the individual act which creates the power might have specific rules. So, for instance, Section 206 of the Electoral Act says that voters must be provided with separate booths in which to cast their votes secretly. So the divisional officer has powers, but that doesn't include the power to just say, we're not going to have individual booths in this division. The second way that the Parliament has made rules about the use of power by public servants is through a more general set of rules, which come to us through the common law and through an act called the Administrative Decisions Judicial Review Act. These rules govern all sorts of administrative decision making. They provide the basic expectations that we as a community can have of any administrative decision maker in any department making any administrative decision. This Act, which we'll call the ADJR Act from this point forward, is the central piece of legislation for administrative law. It's the framework upon which the rest of the system of administrative law is built. Next week, we're going to look at the history which led to the ADJR Act, but after that, right the way through till week 8, we're going to be unpacking the ADJR Act and looking at how it can help us to challenge poorly made government decisions. Okay, that brings us to the end of week 1. You've had a bit of an overview of the subject and why we study it. We've talked through the assessments. We've revised the meaning of the separation of powers. Honestly, that's important. And if you don't completely get it, go back and revise it because it's going to come up again and again. Finally, in this video, we've shown how public service decision makers fit in to the overall grand framework of responsible government. Look forward to seeing you next week.